right, so we will begin with our review of Esther up until this point. Today we'll be doing chapter 7. So if you'll think back with me to the first chapter was our foundational chapter. It established the time period in history, which was about 481 to 484 BCE. We found that we were in the Persian Empire, that was led at that time by King Ahasuerus, or as some people refer to him, Xerxes. We looked at what was going on in the world at the time, which was, as a new king, he was gathering the troops and gathering the information so that he could go to war against the Greeks. So that was all part of an understanding that we had in chapter 1. Then we moved on to chapter 2. We had the introduction of Esther and Mordecai, and Esther becoming queen and all that took place in that. So it was a good story. Operates, it builds on its characters. So you get to know something about the characters as they're introduced. So that's what we had in chapter 2. In 3, we had the introduction of another character, which was Haman. So we get a little bit insight into Haman, and he was identified as an enemy. Then in chapter 4, we have the display of a response to Haman's edict to Jewish extermination by Mordecai. And then the Jews were mourning because of that edict for their annihilation. And then we find Esther's decision to approach the king. So that was chapter 4. Then in chapter 5, we had that the king received Esther into his court, and he has a desire to honor her wishes, while Haman is focused on Mordecai's death. So now in chapter 5, you had the contention that's building. You have that, the evil and the good, those kind of things that are building up. Then in chapter 6, we looked at the turning point in the narrative. So chapter 6 and chapter 7 is the turning point. Together, they show us from one direction to the other where this narrative goes. And at the end, we'll do a summary of the irony and of that change of direction, something that looked like it was going one way, and yet with God's intervention, which some people see as a coincidence, it goes exactly the opposite way. So that was what we finished with in 6. So 7 is a follow-on to that momentum in chapter 6 and into chapter 7 now. So we'll start with the first 7 verses in chapter 7. Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen, and the king said to Esther on the second day, also as they drank their wine in the banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done." Then Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king." Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he? Who would presume to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and enemy is this wicked Haman." Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. The king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. So definitely a significant change of fortunes for all of the characters that we've looked at so far. In verse 1, it demonstrates the beginning of the second banquet starts with the guests drinking wine together, as was the case with the first banquet. In verse 2, the king again addresses Esther early on in the second banquet, as the timing was identified with the drinking of wine in the banquet. So the reason that scriptures are mentioning it is not just to highlight that wine is their thing, it's to highlight the timing. So there was a certain time that you would drink the wine and then the meal. So it's a timing issue that's being revealed here. The king repeats the words to Esther that he had spoken to her the day before, desiring to know what her petition was, and assuring her he would grant her request up to half the kingdom, that it shall be done. So we studied this in detail in the previous chapter on how this phrase was used by the king, making a promise to the person he is speaking to, and that what they would request is being promised to be done for them even before the request is made known to the king. So we looked at that last week, and this is the repeat. He uses the same phrase and the same words. He's not changed his mind overnight. Now, in verse 3, Queen Esther is ready to make her request known. She begins with an address of respect to the king. She says, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king." We talked about this before as well, but this was the proper address that you would give the king, especially in a public setting. And this is public because the servants are in attendance and Haman's in attendance at this banquet. So again, just a thought that if you are going to address somebody with good or bad news, it's probably a really good idea to show respect. You might not want to have to repeat these words, but it's a really good idea to start the communication there. Again, a demonstration of Esther's character. Does Esther know she's right? Does Esther know Haman's wrong? Does Esther know that she has God on her side? She could just flat out say what she has to say and expect it to be done, but she doesn't. So her humble spirit and character are again reflected in the words that she uses here. There is a question between what is a petition and a request in the Persian court. And I don't know that we have an answer to that. Because if you remember, a lot of the records that were maintained by the Persian court were destroyed in the fire that takes place under Artaxerxes, which is the son of King Ahasuerus. So there definitely is a difference, but we have to be really careful on what we assume that difference is. But Esther says, "Let my life be given to me as my petition." That's the petition that she's putting before him. It's kind of like the evidence. This is the evidence that I want to put before you. This is what my request is going to be, that my life be given to me. But secondly, she says, "And my people are my request." It's almost like she's adding that on. So my first petition is this, but it's tied to my request for my people. So Esther desires here to link her own life with her people. Esther doesn't have to do that. Esther could come before the king and only ask that her life be spared from the edict that's been issued. She doesn't choose to do that. She links herself to her people here. I'm asking for my life, but also for my people. I'm linking them together. So again, Esther's character is demonstrated in her willingness to do this before the king and to make this public before the king. So Esther begins with words that it would appear bring shock to the king in this moment. She is asking for her life. And remember, he doesn't know anything else that's been going on. He just knows she's invited. He knows she's been hesitant to ask. He knows it might be something big. But then she drops the bombshell. "I'm asking for my life to be spared." So as the king, imagine the shock he's feeling in that moment that she is bringing this request to him. She continues in connecting the survival that she is asking for with the survival of her people. Again, put yourself in his place. This is the first time he's hearing or had any understanding of this. My queen is saying her life is on the line and her people's life is on the line. So these words, of course, would generate a question as to why Esther feels she needs to make a petition for her life. Right? That's the natural question that would happen. She's just said she's asking for her life. He's like, what do you mean? Well, how is your life in danger? And so that's what we see in verse 4. Esther continues with this explosive language that she and her people have been sold. And that is why she's coming before the king with this request. She says, "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed and annihilated." Okay, that's all caps. We can just put that in all caps. You can imagine how this is shocking news to the king. And for that matter, anybody else in the room who doesn't know what things have been going on behind the scenes, like we've had the privilege of seeing. We've seen the story build up. Not everybody had that advantage here. It's shocking what her words are to this king. So Esther clearly identifies that her and her people have been sold. Then she quotes the very same words that Haman had used in the edict. So imagine now what's going on in Haman's mind as he hears his carefully crafted words from his edict being repeated from the queen to the king. I'd say maybe a heart-stopping moment, potentially, is going on as some things are really falling in place for him. Esther continues demonstrating this humble position that I'm talking about before the king here, as she says, "Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not commensurate with the annoyance to the king." So Esther says that if she and her people were to be relegated as slaves to the king, she would accept this. This would have been something she wouldn't have even brought before the king. She explains that she would not bring something so small of a matter for the king's consideration. What is she doing there? Is she yet again elevating the king in his position as the king over all this kingdom? You have so much on your plate. You make so many grand decisions, and I respect that. I would never have troubled you if we'd just been sold as slaves. Again, constantly giving to the king all the respect that he deserves in this moment. She's the queen, and yet she still defers to him in this gracious manner. So the money that Haman had promised the king to purchase the Jews, remember, it was not insignificant. It was a very large sum of money that easily could be given to the king, and then the Jews just made slaves. That could have been how the funds came into the treasury. He could have bought the Jews, but for the sole purpose of using them as slaves, which of course the Jews have had that in their history quite a bit. So he did not choose to do that. If this had been the case, Esther says that she would not have brought this to the king for his consideration. She was willing to be a servant, her and all her people. She's speaking for the Jews here in this regard. I wouldn't have brought it if it was just that we would be slaves. Notice, Esther does not yet identify herself as a Jew. We need to stop. Is it not recording?
There's a red box on there that's not usually there. No, we're good.
Okay. Oh, so Esther has not yet identified herself as a Jew. Esther does not put the blame on the king for this treachery, even though it was the king that agreed to the proposal put forward by Haman. There's a lot of thinking that went on to how she was going to speak. Esther is giving King Ahasuerus the clear path for him to draw that someone else has done something. Verse 5 demonstrates the king makes exactly the connection that he should, as the scriptures record the word that concerns the king Ahasuerus and the husband of the queen, as he demands to know who is this person and who would do such a thing. And he desires to know where this person is. So very short sentence, but all shows the thinking of the king in the moment. So we already know that the king is aware that he has enemies. So that's not a surprise. That part is not what's surprising here. His life was always in danger. And remember, he had just been reminded the night before when they were reading the Chronicles about two enemies that happened to be within the palace who had desired to put their hands on him and kill him. It's always on his mind. But right now we know it's fresh on his mind because of the Chronicles that were just read to him the night before. And he's aware the threats can come from within the palace. So these are all things he's very familiar with, as this obvious threat is now being identified by Esther. But the king is shocked that anyone would threaten the queen, and he wants to know who would do such a thing. Now, the king made no connection to the edict that Haman had brought to him, even when the exact words of the edict are repeated by Esther to the king. So it would appear that Haman got his permission, but remember, he never announced who it was he was going for. But the king never saw the actual edict, the wording of the edict or the details of the edict. He left that to Haman to carry out the details. So the exact words being presented here, the king had no idea of. That's what my assumption would be as I look through the narrative as it unfolds. Because the king asks that who would presume to do such a thing would indicate that it would take real treachery to pull off such a deed, right? Whoever's trying to do this, I can't assume or understand why anybody would presume to do this. Who, while I am king, would want to come after and kill the queen and all her people? Now remember, Haman is listening in. He's in the room. He's fully attentive. And he's hearing these words being spoken to the king. And it is news to him that the edict would include, the Haman is listening to these words for the first time. And it's news to him that his edict would include harm to Esther. Right? He doesn't know who she is. He doesn't know that she is a Jew. He had no idea that his edict would reach to the highest level of those in the palace. This is all news to him. All news. So this would also mean that Haman had no idea of the relationship between Mordecai and Esther. All of that is news to him. He had no idea. So now, in verse 6, I would say the gig is up. So Esther answers quickly that the person who had made this threat to her is considered a foe and an enemy, ending with her assessment that he is wicked. So she sets all of that up, and then she divulges the name of Haman. Now you're in the room. You've heard the words that are being spoken. When she makes this accusation, do you think she does it with a sweet little voice? Oh, that wicked, horrible Haman. No, I'm telling you, she's probably got a little bit of royalty behind her as she declares this man, this evil, wicked, this foe, it's him, it's Haman. I'm sure she's got some accusations going on with that tone. Now, I'm not there. I'm just saying that's what my mind envisions, so you know where my mind is going, right? Notice again, we talked about this last week, there's a quickness, a feeling of quickness in the narrative. So the question gets asked, and before anybody else can step in or make the conversation go a different way, she immediately answers, and she makes it fast. She makes her accusation. You, again, get that feeling of quickness as these things are unfolding. So Esther identifies Haman, this is the man in the banquet room with them, as the enemy that's desiring to kill her. He had no idea. Now remember that he had no idea. So this is all shocking news to the king and to Haman. This is a brave revelation in this moment for Esther. She doesn't know how the king is going to respond. She doesn't know how this powerful, evil, wicked man, Haman, is going to respond in that moment. She has no idea. So it's not just that Esther was brave when she went forward into the inner court and waited for the scepter to be put out to her. That was one moment of bravery. She is brave again as she lays this accusation against the second most powerful man in the entire kingdom. A man who put a whole lot of money into the king's treasury. A man the king had obviously elevated to a position and people paid homage to him. That's the man she's going toe-to-toe with. And she's just the queen. We often go, oh, king, queen, she's second. Not in a kingdom format like this. She's just the queen. Haman has the second position in all the land, and she's just leveled a significant accusation. Esther has nothing to offer the king that can compare to what Haman had offered the king in regards to this request. So he had money, he had power when he made his request. She comes with nothing to offer the king at all. Esther has relied on God to direct her every action and probably her words in the moment. I don't think she sat at home and wrote it out, had the script ready to go. Maybe she did. Maybe she looked for counsel. But every moment she has to decide, is now the time? Do I mention it now? How am I going to word it? Those things are probably in the back of her mind. It's my belief that Esther is a good example of the words that Christ spoke to his disciples in Matthew. So if you look in Matthew chapter 10, we'll do verses 16 through 20. So she's an example of, I believe, what Christ says to his disciples in Matthew 10, beginning in verse 16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. But be aware of men, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues, and you will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they hand you over, these are the significant, when they hand you over, when you're standing there in the moment, do not worry about how or what you are to say, for it will be given you in that hour what you are to say. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. It's the same God with Esther as it was with the disciples, as it is with you. Don't overthink it. Rely on the Spirit to give you the words in the moment when he's opened the door and there's opportunity to speak, whatever that is. Whether it's in the gospel presentation itself, it's about your witness and your testimony, if it's about mentoring or discipling. Yes, it's okay to think it through, but in the moment, don't hold on to the script. Allow the Spirit to be the one who speaks. And I believe that's exactly what Esther's doing. So we can take comfort and we can boldly know that we can trust in the Father to speak through us. We don't need to have all those plans ahead of time. However, I think it's very important to notice that we need to be shrewd as serpents and yet innocent as doves. There's a time and there's a place, and we need to be aware of that. Because so often I find it's unfortunate that Christians will force their way into a conversation. They'll force answers on somebody, and that person's not looking. And so the door becomes even tighter shut to that communication happening between those two people. So the enemy does not need to have any advanced knowledge of how we're going to move out for our God. But we are to move in innocence, without room for sin. So this is the balance needed in the Christian walk in the world that's hostile to our views and at times can be putting our very existence on the line. And as we watch the things that are unfolding, we know that becomes more and more reality every day. Go back to the scriptures, be here with Esther, and know God will provide the words. He will protect you. But you need to be careful. You need to be shrewd like the serpent. Plan the moves, be aware of the Spirit, but then let go and let the Spirit speak through you. So this was the world that Esther had walked into now in this moment. Haman understands why he's been invited to this banquet. He's been set up by the queen. It is clear from all the words spoken by Esther that she uncovered the details of his plot. Haman has been witness to the king speaking his words and promise to Esther before she made her request known. So he already knows the promise that's on the table, that the king is going to honor whatever her request is going to be. Now that all the events of his day come to a crescendo, Haman realizes his exposure and he becomes terrified before the king and the queen. In verse 7, it's clear Haman has valid reason to be terrified as the king stands up in his anger and he leaves the banquet room to go into the palace garden. I think it might be an understatement to say the mood has changed in the banquet room very quickly. The detail of the king standing up is for us to see the reclining position that he was in, which is a custom in that part of the world. And it's still practiced. So they don't have tables like we have here in chairs. They're on the floor, right? With the table spread on the floor, they're reclining around the floor. So this is the image that we need to have as we see this story unfold. It's the same imagery that we see in the Gospels, right? When Christ has got the disciples around the table. So that picture, if you've got it somewhere in your house, of the table and all of them are gathered on one side as the photo is being taken, that's probably not real, okay? They're all on the floor. They're all circling this table. So the banquet was a place to relax and enter into conversation, and the mood was set for them as they were drinking their wine as well. So I want you to, just because the dramatic change in the mood is so important, that's the first scene that's laid out for us at the beginning of the chapter, and then it takes this dramatic twist. So the king goes from this moment of relaxing and enjoying to being perplexed, and he leaves the room probably to gather his thoughts, because that's a lot of information that he just received all at once. He's processing all of this information that Esther has just given to him. How did this happen, and what is he going to do now? He is shocked that the man he saw as second in command and trusted as the Most High, remember, he called him noble prince. When he decided who was going to parade Mordecai around, he wanted the most noble prince. It was Haman that he turned to. And now he finds out this man wants to destroy his queen. There is no doubt the king had not just left for some quiet contemplation. Haman knows, according to the scripture, that the king had determined to harm him. So whatever the moment was, however it unfolded, the standing up, the rage, the walking out of the room, Haman knows, oh, I'm in trouble. I'm in big trouble. So the fear of harm is not just like injury, for he knows that his life is in danger. So he doesn't run after the king. You would think the king's running out there, Haman would run out there. Wait, there's more to the story. Let me tell you, right? He is so afraid of the moment that the king is in right now, the rage that he's feeling and the emotions. He doesn't go there. No. He stays in the banquet room and he begs for his life from Esther. Remember, the edict stands, but that does not protect Haman from the anger of the king. There will be consequences for the deception that was carried out on the king by Haman, because that's also what's being revealed here. The king had no idea. Haman could have tried to deflect the blame away from himself in that moment. He could have said, wait, I took it to you, king. You signed the edict. Probably not wise with the mood that the king's in at the moment, but he could have tried that strategy. It's not all on me. I didn't do this on my own. I brought it to you, right? He knows it's beyond that. This has gone beyond him even being able to have a conversation with the king. The fact that Haman does not speak a word in that direction might suggest the level of deceit that Haman had used to get the edict worded and signed without all of the information being revealed to the king. He's a very cunning and deceptive man. It might also suggest that he does not think well on his feet with input of advisors. In other words, the king is so shocked by what's going on, he gets up and he leaves the room to process this. He doesn't just stand there and make the decision and declare it in the moment. Haman must direct his attention to Queen Esther, as she was the one with the open invitation to ask anything she wanted to be granted from the king. So her request is there, but the petition of what it's supposed to look like, how it's going to be worded, how it's going to be carried, that hasn't been worked out. We haven't hashed through those details yet. That's still to be done. So Haman's like, whatever she's going to do, I really need to make sure she doesn't include taking my life as part of what she's going to be requesting here, right? That's his focus. Then we move to the rest of the chapter. So we'll do verses 8 through 10. So Esther 7, verses 8 through 10. Now, when the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they had been drinking the wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbana, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai. And the king's anger subsided. Wow. Do you feel like you've been in a little tornado of words in this whole story? Like we're just swirling with all the things as they've changed so quickly. In verse 8, there is no detail on how long the king was out there walking around in the palace garden. But when he returns from the palace, where he had previously been reclining and drinking the wine, he sees Haman falling on the couch where Esther is. Interesting note of words that are used here. The fact that Haman is falling on Esther, who is a Jew, is an attempt to request mercy from him. And remember that it was his intention to fall on all the Jews for their destruction. So it's an interesting twist of fall on. Secondly, there's a word here used for falling that's the same as we found back in Esther 6:13. So in Esther 6:13, this is what we read. Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but you will surely fall before him. So do you see the literary use of the word fall back there in chapter 6? And now you see him falling on Esther. The same word is used here in chapter 7. So the king sees the events that are taking place in the room when he returns, and it's his assessment by the appearance that Haman was basically assaulting the queen. So it would appear Haman was not on his knees begging for mercy. So whatever his approach is, however this has happened, it appears there's an assault on the queen. So the king rises to new heights of anger as he accuses Haman not only of inappropriate behavior seen as an assault towards the queen, but his indignation is magnified as the action takes place against his queen while he's still basically in the house. I'm still here. You know I'm around, and yet you would think to do this? I don't even know what word you would use, because I don't know that I've ever felt this kind of disbelief and anger. That's what this king is dealing with. Our modern vernacular might be, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This is what he is saying. The scriptures indicate as the king spoke, they covered Haman's face. So first, note the use of the word. It's in a singular form. The word covered his face. But the action that's taken is displayed by a plural they. There would be attendants that are here with the queen. It's not like they left Haman and Esther together in the room alone and everybody else left. So there's attendants that are there. And there's attendants that are with the king. So just because he stormed out didn't mean he walked and strolled alone. They always have somebody with them. So the attendants to the king and the queen take action at hearing the king's word, and they subdue Haman, and they probably cover his face. Kind of like the best picture would be in the old westerns. You see somebody that's going to go to the gallows. They put a hood right over their head. They've been marked. That's the one that's being marched up to the gallows. Something is put over his face. Something is put to retain him and keep him from either further words or further threats or whatever. This was done to protect Esther and the king from any potential harm that Haman might do to them. He's desperate at this moment. His gig is up. Who knows what he might do? Verse 9 identifies one of the attendants that's present is Harbona. And they identify him as one of the 7 eunuchs who served the king. Now remember, we heard this name before. We heard this previously all the way back in chapter 1, verse 10. So way back in chapter 1, verse 10, this is what we read. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcas, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus. So if this is the same man, then this man has been in the service to the king a very long time. So Abana had served for the king for a long time, and now he enlightens the king about some information that he had, and that there were gallows that just happened to be standing at Mordecai's house, and they are 50 cubits high. But he doesn't leave it there. Harbona adds, these gallows had been made for Mordecai. Ooh, that's shocking. The Mordecai who spoke good on behalf of the king, as had been brought to the attention of the king when? Just the night before. That Mordecai. That Mordecai that you know what's, because don't you think the eunuch would have been around for part of that, either the reading of the Chronicles or whatever else, the whole episode of Haman having to parade him around, all of that. He's witness to all of that. And so he reveals this shocking news. He says, the Mordecai the king desired to honor this morning, the Mordecai the king had instructed Haman to honor this morning, this Mordecai, Haman has made a 50-foot gallows to hang him on. Do you think the king is yet again in shock about all this information that's being revealed to him? Quickly, one thing after the other, all these details are being brought forward for him. Harbona would have been aware of the important happenings in the citadel, especially things involving those who had access to the king. It would have been hard to keep the building of a 50 cubits high gallows a secret, as it happened overnight. Haman had not felt he needed to keep anything secret, right? He didn't feel any need for secrets, as he was wealthy and he had the authority to do as he pleases. So he didn't keep it quiet that he had the gallows built, or obviously who they were for. The servant does his job of not only relaying the information to the king, then he waits, but that's what the servant did. He said, by the way, that Haman guy right there, he had these gallows built that are 50 cubits high. Oh, and you know why he had them built? He was going to hang Mordecai on those very gallows. What do you think, king? Right? He doesn't finish with that. He just puts out the information. I love that part. The silence he speaks. In silence, sometimes we can speak. The final verse is short, but it has significant impact. As in verse 10, the statement is simply made that Haman is hanged on the gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai. The last words are that the king's anger subsided. So the death of Haman brought relief to the king of his overwhelming anger. Where was that same thought brought to us before in these scriptures? Wasn't it Haman whose insidious anger and wrath towards Mordecai when he wouldn't bow down? And he goes home and the advice is the only thing that's going to bring you relief so you can go to the banquet in a good mood is to go ahead and get Mordecai killed. So here that's all been laid out with other characters in different parts of their act. And here we find the final, that God made sure that there was anger and that it was subsided by somebody's death, but it was the king's anger and Haman's death. If you're not a writer, it's okay. But it's sometimes interesting that even without being a writer, you're like, there's just seems to be so many of these little opposite twists involved in this very short story. So I looked up some terms for literary irony. And I will include that on there if you have an interest to learn more about that. So you can click on that and go do some research. But here's the highlights of the 3 forms of irony that can exist. First is dramatic irony, and that occurs when the audience knows something that the story characters don't know yet. The second thing is situational irony, and that describes a plot and the events with unexpected and contradictory outcomes. So that's the second form of irony. And the third form of irony is called verbal irony, and it refers to the use of dialogue when one thing is spoken, but a contrasting meaning is intended. So there's examples of all 3 of these. So I've made the list of the ones I could find, and you might find others, and if you do, please let me know, because I would like to add them. So in the book of Esther, we see dramatic irony in several places. So first would be Haman not knowing that Esther is Jewish, right? So we as those that read the story, as the audience, we know that, but Haman doesn't know that. So that would be the first one. Haman not knowing that the king had desired to honor Mordecai. We knew that was coming, We had that narrative unfold, but when Haman walks in, he's got no idea that that's what the king's intention was. Haman not knowing that Mordecai and Esther are related. We know all that detail because it's been built from the beginning of the narrative. He has no idea. Haman not knowing that Esther knows the details of his edict. To some degree, he's been able to keep some of that quiet or secret. He has no idea that she's aware of all of these details. Haman not knowing that Harbona knows about the gallows and his intended use for the gallows. We've had that revealed to us as we've read the story. Haman doesn't come into the room with any necessary idea that this man knows that. So those would be what we would call the dramatic irony events. The situational irony would be things like Mordecai was honored and not Haman, right? So you expect one to be honored and yet the other one is. Haman hanged and not Mordecai. So the story unfolds, one it's supposed to happen to one and yet it ends up happening to the other who had desired to be the one to hang the other one. So it's not just some random person was hanged in place of Mordecai. His enemy is the one that is hanged. Haman demanding that others fall down in homage to him finds himself falling down before Esther. Haman determined harm to the Jews, but the king determined harm to Haman. Again, there could be others. Those were just the ones that I could see. And in the verbal irony, the two that I could kind of see was the words falling down and how they were used one way and how we saw it unfold here, and the covered face. So when we look at it in scripture, when you first read through, it's like the words covered him, which is true. The words did cover him. He heard the words. They had impact on what was going to happen to him. But the they of covering his face was also a physical act of covering his face, in some ways being marked for what's to come. So the spiritual items that we see again in all this irony, right? We add all this irony up. God is sovereign in his work. And I'm sorry if you are tired of hearing that. God is sovereign, God is sovereign, God is sovereign over every single event that happens throughout history and in our time and in our lives. He is a sovereign God. The details here, like I did the highlight from the end of chapter 6, the few that I would add here is the timing of Esther's request for the second banquet, right? That's just a coincidence. And we see, no. All the events had to happen in chapter 6. The king couldn't sleep. That was just the book. All the things that we talked about last week feed into this. That she didn't make her request the day before. She made a request at the second banquet. The total surprise to Haman of what Esther was going to request. He had no idea. With all his spies, because remember, he's going to have spies around, hanging out in the palace, reporting back to him. That's one of the reasons he became such a powerful and cunning person. And yet that one just happens to slip by his notice. Again, God's sovereign. The knowledge that Harbona had about Haman and what he had done to build the gallows, as well as that they were built for Mordecai. God was sovereign in the revelation of all of the details of the events going on within this kingdom in a short period of time for the outcome God had intended to happen. We've read this verse before. I told you when I read it before that it was going to be applied again. So we're going to look at Psalms chapter 10 and verses 1 through 3 because it is so perfect here. It's a description in the Psalms and we get to see a story where it's absolutely carried out. So Psalm 10, starting in verse 1. Why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In pride, the wicked hotly pursue the afflicted. Let them be caught in the plots which they have devised. For the wicked boasts of his heart's desire, and the greedy man curses and spurns the Lord. Does that not sum up the entirety of what we've seen happen and unfold in this narrative of Esther? Many wicked men will accuse others of doing exactly what they themselves are contemplating. That happens because people think that others think like they do. So if somebody has a tendency to lie, let's say, not always give the complete truth. When somebody's telling them something, they're looking through the world with those glasses, assuming others will lie like they do. That's just part of human nature. I've done counseling with women and, they're being accused of something. And yet when the reality comes out, it was really the other person that was doing exactly that thing. So that's just a human nature that we bring. The way we see the world, we think others see the same things. If let's say we have high perfectionistic tendencies on ourselves, we think everybody else has that same standard. They're having it on themselves, they're having it on us, and it's always there. And surprise, surprise, what I discovered was that's not true. Not everybody else has that same thing going on in their mind that I had brought to a situation. So when we become believers, we have the Holy Spirit that allows us to break that sinful process, whatever it is, by repenting and coming to know the Lord, and not just staying there, but becoming more Christ-like. We are to be more like Christ. We are to demonstrate, as the story showed, a humble heart like Esther, the character like Esther, the fortitude like Esther. And the same thing is true for Mordecai. The character that he brought stayed focused, and he did exactly what the Lord directed him to do. How do we become more Christ-like? Well, there's a whole ton of scripture, so we could do a whole other hour on this. So we're not. I'll just save you all that right up front. But we are going to go to Romans, and we're going to look at Romans chapter 8. We're going to start in verses 9 through 11, and then I'm going to skip to verse 28. So we're going to do two sections within Romans, starting in chapter 8, first starting in verse 9 through 11. However, you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. In other words, if you're a believer, you have the power of the Spirit. But if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he doesn't belong to him. That's how you know a believer. A believer has a spirit and a unbeliever doesn't. It's really simple. But we don't know that from the outside, because yet again, God didn't give the little glowing Holy Spirit sign that I still think would be a good idea. But anyway, if Christ is in you, though the body, your body, dead because of sin, yet the Spirit is alive in you because of righteousness. So there's the contrast for us to see. But if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit that dwells in you. You have the Spirit. Everything you need is already there. It's just a matter of letting that Spirit in you be what is exposed outside of you. The actions that you take are based on the direction that the Spirit leads you. You don't need something else from the outside. You have what you need to be Christ-like because you have Christ. You can't do it without him, but you can do it with him. You can be Christ-like because you have Christ in you. Later in Romans, same chapter 8, but we'll do verses 28 and 29. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So again, defining who these people are that can do that would be those who are believers. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to what? To become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. That's what you're predestined to be, conformed to his image. That is what we're called to. Do you see the events in your life where God has been sovereign, where he's displayed that to you? Of course, I declare everything is, but there are some things that come to our mind that we go, wow, yeah, I really can kind of see that was sovereignly orchestrated in my life. Often these jewels of insight don't become clear in the moment. It's in hindsight when we look back at events and we can go, Now that I'm thinking on it, I see some things. I was informed of some things later that really bring me to an understanding. God's fingers were all over that in the moment that I couldn't possibly understand it. Do we always get that? No. Do we get the full breadth of all that he's done? No, not here, not during this time. But sometimes he gives us those glimpses because we're his children, and it's an encouragement to us to know that he's been sovereignly at work. So my question is to you, do you praise God when he delights to reveal those things to you? When those moments come to mind for you, do you stop and do you thank him for that? Not just the thing that happened, but for the revelation of the thing that happened. That's twofold. The thing that happened, you can now give praise for in a way you couldn't have before. But the fact he revealed it to you should also be a thing of praise in your life. And do you then share those events with others? That's discipleship. That's being Christ-like. That's what we're called to do. You get the Spirit. You don't just sit and have a Spirit happy party, which is fine to have, but just share it. Because I can tell you the impact when you give a real story from your life that you can share with somebody else. If the Spirit's opened that door, you have no idea the impact it might have on that person. And sometimes they'll share it with you. They'll tell you, when you shared this, that brought this to mind for me. Sometimes it'll never be shared with you, but it doesn't mean it wasn't used. So that's the importance of being filled, desiring to be Christ-like because he's there, waiting on those moments for him to open doors of opportunity, and stepping into the moments when he has opened the door. Esther stepped into her moments. Not just once, not what the movies want to put there. Her life was stepping into the moment. She stepped into the harem, not knowing what the outcome was going to be. She stepped into the position of queen, not knowing what the outcome was going to be. She stepped into the position of being the daughter of Mordecai. She was used in every situation in which God put her in. And when her father tells her what the edict is, she could have looked the other way because nobody knew she was a Jew. But she didn't. And she goes to great lengths in this chapter to associate herself with her people so that her outcome is completely tied to her people. Whatever you're going to allow to happen to them is going to happen to me. That's a woman that has courage and is brave. But she can only do that because she knows who God is. All of this revealed to us in a book that doesn't even bother to mention the word God.